Good afternoon. My name is Nick Pecora, and today I'll be presenting on violence in video games, America's scapegoat. So, Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto, Mortal Kombat, Battlefield. It's probably a pretty safe statement to say that all of us in this room have either played or at least watched gameplay of one, if not all, of these games. I'd say it's also a pretty safe statement to make that nobody in this room has either committed or wanted to commit violent crime. The same can probably be said for any of our friends that are exposed to similar games. This is because video games are not created to influence our behavior, but are created to offer gamers access to a unique sensory world, much like the ones referenced in the stimulus material, Sense and Sensibility, a molecular logic of olfactory perception. The purpose of video games can be further explained by a passage from Lewis Carroll's 1872 novel, Through the Looking Glass. In this novel, the main character, Alice, passes through a looking glass into a new world. Immediately, she finds her old world common and uninteresting. This is what video games do. They offer gamers access to a world that is more exciting than theirs as a kind of sensory escape from their lives. So the problem perhaps was best articulated by Laura Hudson when she said, "When will politicians stop pretending imaginary bullets are more dangerous than real bullets?" Now this quote, the problem this quote is describing is the conversation going on in this country today over whether or not video games can cause violent behavior in individuals. This problem has led politicians primarily, to lead a sort of attack, I suppose you could say, against the video game industry. One such politician is Governor Matt Bevin of Kentucky, who told a Miami area talk radio show that, quote, "Guns are not the problem. We have a cultural problem in America. You look at the culture of death being celebrated." He goes on in the interview to explain that video games are one of the primary causes for what he refers to as the celebration of a culture of death. Organizations such as the Parents Television Council share this view. They wrote an article for U.S. News in which they stated, quote, "The government should stop kids from playing violent video games." So basically the argument against this conversation, or I suppose the problem with this conversation, is that limitations on the development and distribution of video games containing violence is not a viable solution to violence in society. So the first reason that banning video games or limiting video games containing violence is not necessarily a good thing is that many of these games bring educational value to the table. Perhaps the prime example of this is the Assassin's Creed game series, which, as you can see from these screenshots from 3 games in the series, depict historical events. Moving clockwise on this slide, the Renaissance, French Revolution, and American Revolution are depicted. The series was described by Rolling Stone magazine as a tool not just for entertainment and occasional bloodlust, but one for peaceful exploration and potential education. Additionally, a new non-violent educational mode was added to the newest installment in the series, Assassin's Creed Origins, as a peaceful way to further your educational experience in this game. According to The Verge, this mode serves as an alternative to the violence contained in the game to allow children to play the game for the sole purpose of learning about these historical events. So one of the main arguments of supporters of the idea that video games should be banned or limited if they contain violence is that the video games that contain violence cause children exposed to them to act violently. Now, several studies have disproven this, one of which was conducted by Whitney DeCamp, an associate professor of sociology at Western Michigan University. In this study, titled "Impersonal Agencies of Communication, Comparing Video Games and Other Risk Factors on Violence," he concluded that, quote, "Immediately it is clear that playing violent video games does not have a significant impact on the probability of hitting someone within these matched samples." Additionally, a study conducted by researchers from German and American universities concluded that, they studied the frequency of violent crime using data from the National Incident-Based Reporting System in the weeks following the release of popular video games. And they found that in the weeks following their releases, that a doubling of video game sales is associated with a 2 to 3% decrease in crime. Now that statistic refers to the sales of video games in general. When you look specifically at violent video games, as you can see here, the crime rate essentially stays the same, as you can see from that bottom number there. This is explained by Christopher Ferguson, an associate professor and co-chairman of the psychology department at Stetson University, when he said, basically, by keeping young males busy with things they like, you keep them off the streets and out of trouble. So you've heard all about why the calls to ban or limit violence in video games are not necessarily helpful to society. So now the question is, what solutions are the right answers? How can we fix this if limiting video games is not the answer? One way is through anti-violence campaigns and outreach programs. For the sake of this presentation, I'll use an example from the Australian government, who put out a campaign focused on sexual assault and violence against women in particular. The pros to this solution, in this case, is that 1 in 3 Australian women has been victim to physical or sexual violence since age 15 by someone known to them. And also, campaigns such as this one are made to reverse societal norms. As you can see here, this particular campaign demonstrates very well the purpose of similar campaigns. At the top it says, violence against women doesn't just start, it grows, let's stop it at the start, with a picture of a young boy there. This implies that by teaching children from the time they're young that violence is not okay and will not be tolerated, that is a better way to go about stopping violence in society than to ban things such as video games and other forms of entertainment. So the second solution is further gun control measures. This solution really applies to America in particular. America has a very unique issue with gun violence. America has 6 times as many firearm homicides as Canada and around 16 times as many as Germany, according to data provided to The Guardian by the United Nations. Also, states, just looking within the United States, states with higher rates of gun ownership experience more gun-related deaths, according to the Injury Prevention and Control Center. So obviously the statistics show a serious problem, and the results have been proven by the statistic that states that contain less guns in the household experience less gun deaths. It's as simple as that. The cons to this is that frankly it's a lot easier said than done. Legislation has to be passed for the solution to be enacted, and that's not very easy. One congressional staffer was asked by the Daily Beast if there was any optimism when it came to legislation pertaining to gun violence. The staffer simply replied, "I would say no." Additionally, one bill regarding common sense background checks when it comes to purchasing firearms has garnered 62 co-sponsors in the United States Senate. This would be enough for passage of the bill. However, the Senate Majority Leader has simply refused to bring the bill to the floor. This shows that even when a bill garners enough support, it still faces difficulties when it comes to getting it passed through the United States legislative system. So in conclusion, violent video games are not inherently bad just because they contain some violence. And banning video games is not necessarily a solution to violence in society due to video games' lack of connection with violence in society. Also, other solutions are more likely to help the problem. Resources would be much better spent focusing on some solutions that I've mentioned and others more than they would be better used on those solutions than they would be used on banning video games. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Could you tell me how you handled the differing perspectives in order to reach a conclusion?
Yeah, so I obviously, for the presentation, I tried to use different perspectives. And a lot of the perspectives that were available came from, they're very academic, researchers, professors. But I also tried to go out and find, reviews like the one I mentioned from the Rolling Stone magazine that referenced the educational value of a specific video game series. That perspective, I think it was important to include something like that to bolster the argument being conveyed by the academic perspectives.
Okay, thank you. And then your final question is, what advice would you have for other researchers who consider the topic of violence in video games?
So I suppose the best advice I could give to someone choosing that same topic is to really find just a lot of evidence to support your problem. Dig deeper than just academic evidence. Find something that I was kind of frustrated with being unable to find as a perspective of students or the teenagers, which is primarily what this argument is about. The exposure of kids to video games. I was kind of frustrated that I wasn't able to find solutions or perspectives from that demographic, and so I would say to do all you can to find a perspective like that that's a little bit outside the box. I think it'll really help the argument.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.